All right, good afternoon, everyone. Last presentation before lunch, so let's get into it. As you can see, my presentation has to do with climate neutrality, which is a little bit of an ambiguous term because people use the term to refer to different things in different ways, and I'll explain the way I'm using it in a moment. But firstly, let me just give you some disclosures. This research I'm presenting was partly funded by Australia's Meat and Livestock Australia organisation, an organisation that invests in research and marketing on behalf of the red meat industry, and it was partly financed by CSIRO. But even though there was funding from MLA, the decision was made to publish the research results before they were known, and MLA had no involvement in interpretation of the results or analysis of the results whatsoever. Now, I need to quickly build a little bit of a foundation, or else these results will not make any sense to you. I may be saying some things that are very familiar to you, and bear with me if that's the case, or it may be less familiar to others. But this is a statement coming from the Paris Agreement, the key statement that relates to the temperature stabilisation goal, that the temperature shall not be allowed to proceed higher and higher and higher, but at the same time the goal does not describe a goal of returning to some former temperature regime, the 1850s or whatever. It's about staying within this 1.5 to 2 degree range. So it can be broadly described as stabilisation or plateauing of the climate change. And that implies different goals for different gases. And even the IPCC itself uses this term stabilisation of the climate. I wanted to quote the IPCC because I want you to see that this is coming from the basic science and not just a novel interpretation from me. But the IPCC says stabilising the climate will require strong, rapid and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. I think we all appreciate that. And reaching net zero CO2 emissions. Well, on the other hand, limiting other greenhouse gas emissions and air pollutants such as methane could have benefits for health and the climate. So it's very clear that if we're going to stabilise the climate, different goals apply to different gases, and this relates to the fact that CO2 has a very long-term or persistent impact on the climate, whereas other shorter-lived gases have more of a short-term and cycling characteristic, which means that the goals in relation to those gases are different. And in the case of the livestock industry, because the greenhouse gas emissions are predominantly short-lived methane, the way in which you add these gases up together makes a huge difference. It's important to point out that there's no absolute equivalent. Often people sum up the different gases because they want to talk about the different greenhouse gases in aggregate. But there's no, and often the term CO2 equivalence is used, but there's absolutely no absolute equivalence between methane and CO2 or nitrous oxide. Often people quote, oh, methane is 28 times worse. Well, it's only 28 times worse under certain criteria. By different models and different assumptions, it has different relationship to CO2 in terms of its climate impact. And we've even seen today carbon footprint information being shared without describing the way in which those gases were aggregated. And some people seem to have this idea that there's only one way of adding them all up, but that's not true at all. And I don't mean to read this paragraph, but it's cut and paste out of the IPCC's fifth assessment report. And it makes the very statement, in fact, it uses the very specific term that the common way of adding up the greenhouse gases using the global warming potential 100 years climate metric, there's no scientific argument for choosing that way of adding up and creating some type of CO2 equivalence than any other method. And in fact, in using GWP 100, there is a value judgment associated with using that climate metric. So I think it's very important to point that out. And the IPCC further reinforces that with the terminology that's been applied in the sixth assessment report, where the term carbon neutrality refers specifically to carbon dioxide only. And the term greenhouse gas neutrality has been introduced when there's some metric weighted aggregate of greenhouse gas emissions. So the term now used by the IPCC, carbon neutral, applies only to CO2, and greenhouse gas neutrality is the term that should be used if we're talking about an aggregate of greenhouse gases. And why that's important, here's further text coming from the IPCC. Achieving global net zero CO2 emissions is a requirement for stabilising the climate, as was pointed out earlier. This is different from achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions, where metric weighted anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions equal metric weighted anthropogenic greenhouse gas removals. And the second paragraph, emission pathways that reach and sustain net zero greenhouse gas emissions result in a decline in surface temperature. So actually net zero greenhouse gas emissions is over the long term a cooling strategy. And we have to ask ourselves that, or what this is saying is that net zero CO2 is needed to stabilise the climate, but net zero greenhouse gas emissions is climate cooling strategy. And so is it about no more warming or no more emissions? And that's an important point it makes, because it's going to be very difficult to sustain a ruminant livestock industry if the goal is no emissions. And as you've probably seen before, and other people have created diagrams such as this, perhaps more elegant than this one, that biogenic methane, which is the main greenhouse gas emission from ruminant livestock systems, is biogenic. It's part of a short-term natural cycle which is happening on average over the course of about 12 years. So CO2 from the atmosphere is assimilated into grass via photosynthesis. Some of that can contribute to soil carbon. The animals eat the grass, of course, and they have processes that happen in the rumen which creates methane, which converts back to CO2 on a relatively short-term cycle. So I said I was using this term climate neutral, and this is the way I'm using it. I'm calculating what has come to known as a radiative forcing footprint, which is a little bit like a balance sheet if you're familiar with accounting. It quantifies the radiative forcing from current emissions plus the radiative forcing from historical emissions that remain in the atmosphere. And so, of course, some of those historical emissions are very persistent, and other historical emissions have already been removed. They're no longer contributing to the current radiative forcing. And climate neutral can be described as a condition whereby a system is making no net contribution to increasing radiative forcing, which is a predeterminant for stabilising the climate. If we're not pushing radiative forcing higher and further, then the climate's not going to progress. Climate change is not going to progress further. So this is a method that was used in this study. We created a disaggregated time series from 1990, the first year of official emissions accounting, through to 2020, which was the last year of current data at the time the study was conducted, for the Australian red meat industry, including cattle production, including feedlot finishing, sheep meat production, which was including only the part that was attributable to the sheep meat production, taking away the wool part of the industry, goats and domestic red meat processing. Those emissions were extrapolated to 2030 because the industry has some goals relating to that year in two ways. Firstly, under a business as usual scenario, and according to the industry, cattle numbers are anticipated to increase up by 13% and sheep numbers by 18%. That is information coming from the industry itself. Now, of course, the industry may have an overly optimistic projection about its future growth, but they were the numbers that were used in projecting forward those emissions to 2030, assuming under business as usual, the cattle numbers would grow by 13% and sheep numbers by 18%. Then a second scenario was undertaken where greenhouse gas and mitigation sequestration interventions were overlaid on top of the business as usual scenario, including those increased cattle numbers. And the radiative forcing footprint was calculated using parameters and equations from the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. The very same parameters and equations that are used to derive your GWP 100 factors, the global warming potential factors, with the units of the radiative forcing footprint being the units of radiative forcing. In this case, because the quantities are very small, it's milliwatts per square metre. So these are all the interventions that were modelled. I won't go into great detail now because we're obviously waiting to have our lunch, but it's broad-based and it includes what the industry in Australia refers to as high-impact feed additives. This is your 3-NOP and your Asparagopsis seaweeds. Other feed additives, grape, marc and tannins and so forth. Certain forage crops, breeding for lower methane emissions, planting of trees on farms, management systems to increase soil carbon storage, savanna burning management, which is a practice of low-intensity burning of the undergrowth during the cooler seasons to reduce the incidence of very intense and high-emitting wildfires, and improve herd management and flock management. And I won't go into all the details there, but the objective was to look at what might be realistically achievable in the industry between now and 2030. Now, obviously, we don't have a crystal ball. These efficacy rates and so forth, of course, some very well-controlled trials can demonstrate higher efficacy, but most likely those high results are not likely to be achieved across the board in industry. So, getting to 2 slides all the results will be in 2 slides. This is what the radiative forcing footprint looks like under the business as usual scenario, which is carrying on the way the industry is practicing today, but with the 13% increase in beef cattle numbers and the 18% increase in sheep numbers. Now, it may take a little bit of time to interpret it, but the contribution to radiative forcing is on the y-axis. As you can see, from 2005 to about 2015, the radiative forcing footprint increased marginally, year upon year upon year, but to around 7 milliwatts per square metre contribution to global radiative forcing. But as you can see, from about 2015 up to 2020, it has been more or less flat. So what that's saying is that the industry has not made any additional contribution to radiative forcing since around 2015. And actually in 2019 and 2020, the radiative forcing footprint of the industry fell. So that's saying its contribution to radiative forcing of the industry has decreased, which is equivalent to actually CO2 removal. If it was a fossil fuel industry, it would require CO2 extraction from the atmosphere, net negative CO2. As you can see, under a business as usual scenario, it continues to remain more or less flat. Now, I just make a point. I'll show you the results with the interventions in a moment. But there's a reason here to stop and pause for a moment. Because if you take the exact same emissions and apply the conventional GWP 100 climate metric, many people would conclude that sheep meat and beef meat are among the most greenhouse gas intensive and polluting foods in our whole food system. And there's many argument being portrayed that meat consumption, the industry needs to be decreased in scale and consumption of these foods needs to be reduced for the sake of climate change. But at the same time, you take exactly the same emissions data and using the exact same parameters, you calculate it in a different way. It shows the industry has not, since 2015, been making any further contribution to climate change. So I'm coming from the field of life cycle assessment, and we're very critical, or we should be very critical, of the environmental indicators and metrics that are chosen and used. What this is showing is that you can take exactly the same emissions data and apply two different metrics and come up with absolutely opposing conclusions, which is reason to be very sceptical. It's reason to ask, whenever anybody is presenting information using the GWP 100 climate metric, which is the integral of radiative forcing over a future 100-year timescale. Now, it's a metric. I'm not sure personally what information or interpretation you can take from it, because it doesn't tell you anything about when in the future those climate impacts are occurring. So it's in my view, it's quite obscure. But in my opinion, anyone who's using that data, they should be fairly challenged and say, why did you use that climate metric? And if they haven't got a good reason, justification for choosing that environmental indicator, then I think there's good reason to be sceptical. For me, this metric shows very transparently when the impacts are occurring over time and whether those impacts are increasing or not. So with a combination of interventions, of course, we analysed it intervention by intervention and every different combination and so forth. So I'm just showing you all the interventions combined based on the notion that the settings were chosen so that they were realistically achievable without having any special knowledge about what might happen in the future. But what it shows is that by 2030, the radiative forcing footprint has further declined to 6.8 milliwatts per square metre, showing that actually even though the production is increasing, the industry's total contribution to climate change is actually historically retracting. It's reducing its climate impact over time. Better than carbon neutral. I won't say too much about this, but it was the interventions that were making the most contribution to the difference between business as usual and the figures that I explained. It's in the conference summary. But the key messages, the Australian red meat industry has contributed to global radiative forcing increase, which has contributed in part to the climate change we experience today. And everyone accepts that. Everyone who's driven a car or taken a flight or eaten anything or worn clothes or done anything has made a contribution to the radiative forcing increase that exists today. And the Australian red meat industry has done that. But since around 2015, the industry has not made a further contribution to radiative forcing. That footprint was flat. It has not contributed to further radiative forcing increases. In 2020, the radiative forcing footprint actually decreased, equivalent to CO2 removal. So I would conclude that with radiative forcing management, and actually there's an international standard, an ISO document, 14082, which is in the process of being drafted, which will discuss radiative forcing management. The Australian red meat industry can continue to grow and contribute to food security, some of the most nutrient-dense food products that we have, and do so within the constraints of climate stabilisation. And because the climate radiative forcing footprint is receding, it actually has the potential to assist other sectors to meet climate goals if sequestration activities can be most economically efficiently achieved in the red meat industry. So as for the RF footprint approach, I know it's not terribly widespread. It has much in common with the GWP STAR, which some of you may have heard about and has been written about a bit. It is a multi-gas assessment without subjective weighting factors. It is a transparent presentation of impact over time, with the results from the GWP 100, you don't know whether those impacts are short-lived or long-term or whatever. Here you can see it's very good for performance tracking, which in my experience is something that GWP star is not so good at, because the numbers can fluctuate very largely from year to year based on just the natural variation we have in livestock numbers in Australia from year to year. And the approach is based entirely on IPCC parameters and models. So if you're critical of this approach, you should at least be equally critical with the GWP 100 metric and all results that are obtained from it. So with that, hopefully we can all go and have lunch soon.